Okay, as previously mentioned in the slide we just left behind, even though in the European consciousness, let's say in 1492 and the subsequent decades and even centuries after that, even though from the European mindset all Indians were the same race, what I emphasized was this is hardly the truth. Native Americans or Indians hardly thought of themselves as a single racial category. In fact, what's remarkable here is in many ways, Native Americans were more diverse than Europeans at that time. Okay, so when we think about the ways that different peoples are distinguished from one another, right, different groups of people, we tend to think of culture, we tend to think of language, even, of course, skin color sometimes or oftentimes. So let's look at this and see how diverse the Native Americans were when, let's say, Columbus and the first Spanish explorers first came to the New World and discovered it. Now, again, let me say that discovery is, again, it's very slanted, right? It's from the perspective of the Spanish and other Europeans after them, right? You can't really discover something that already exists, right? So I'll use that word loosely. Okay. In any case, let's look at diversity among Native Americans. Let's say in 1491, okay, before the Europeans came. In terms of linguistic groups, what's remarkable is there was more diversity in the Americas than um, in Europe. There's more than 1,000 different languages among the different native inhabitants. Okay. In fact, if we look at what would be called eventually, many, many years later, California, right, the west coast of North America, if we look at that region alone, in let's say 1491, there's more languages spoken in that area of the world than the entirety of Europe. Okay, again, this is before contact. All right, so what does that tell us? It's very diverse in terms of linguistic communities, right? It's diverse again. Now, in terms of physical features, there's drastic differentiation as well. By the way, what is the image that most Americans have when we think about Native Americans? Okay, chances are they're very similar. I ask you, in fact, right now, I invite you to think of an Indian Native American in your mind, right? There's a big chance that most of us are thinking of the same image, right? Perhaps the person with a headdress with long hair, right, dressed in animal skin, right? Maybe a warrior with paint on, and so forth, right? Well, sure. That image, by the way, came from the Sioux Indians, who the United States actually were in a perennial conflict with, militarily speaking, especially after the Civil War. The Great Indian Wars were against the Sioux. So that's why that image prevails in our mind. But if we really look at the different physical features, we'll be surprised to discover that there's so much physical differentiation. Here's what you were probably thinking of: the Dakota Sioux tribe. Many of us, right? Again, that's largely because our historical consciousness, especially when we think about Hollywood and so forth, right? That's how they're depicted. But that's not the only way they looked, of course. Here is one Native American from the, and I know I'm butchering this pronunciation, Kwakiutl tribe. Hopefully that's close enough. And by the way, when I first saw this, I would have guessed somewhere in Asia. Like it almost looks like a Japanese sort of, feudal samurai era warrior, right? But that's hardly the case. This is a native of a tribe where, or it's basically the Pacific Northwest, maybe the lower regions of Alaska, Washington State. Okay. And that person does not look like the other person. Here's another. Um, uh, Here are other representatives of another tribe, the Hopi tribe. And when you look at this, they do not look like the previous two, the Kowaki Udal and the Dakota Sioux. Okay, the Hopi tribe were found in the southwestern regions of the U.S., like New Mexico and Arizona. Okay, but maybe not Arizona, more New Mexico region. Okay, so that's the Hopi tribe. To me, they look more Amazonian, like from South America, right? So my whole point is this: we have to sort of expunge or get rid of, cast out that idea that Indians look all the same. They're diverse, just like they're diverse in terms of language. Okay, diversity is the big theme here. Okay, now 1 second here. Let me put this on hold. Okay, we're back to this slide. So social organization. We talked about language groups, and its diversity in 1491 or before Columbus. We talked about physical features being so diverse. I could have went on and on, right, with different tribes. That's only 3 tribes I talked about. I could have went on and on with in terms of physical features. Social organization, what we see in the Americas before European contact, is a surprising high degree of different ways the Indians organize themselves, the different Indian tribes, right? Now, again, when we think about Indians today, right, not to mention, decades earlier, through our history, in fact, the typical American, many of us conceive of them as being sort of nomadic and hunter-gatherers, right? That is to say, they're chasing the buffalo. They don't form permanent settlement, such as towns, right? They might have a village, but we tend to think of them as not really forming big cities, right? And towns. We don't think of them as bound to the soil or bound to the earth, right? As agriculturalists, as we see, for example, in Europe at the same time. All right, so, well, it is true that many were, in fact, nomadic. They tended to move with the seasons, move with, their main means of, food, diet, or what have you, like the buffalo. But not all of them, of course. Some were agriculturalists, in other words. Jumping ahead to this is a depiction of Indians working in the field. And this is according to what some European, artists, in his mind, artistic rendering here of Indians working on the field, right? And it looks just like Europe, right? They're not nomadic; they're stuck to the earth. In fact, or bound to the earth. Excuse me. In fact, what's interesting about this is another way to think about conflict, and I mentioned with the first slide, right? There's going to be quite a bit of misunderstanding in terms of culture, right? And social mores and behavior, right? Between the two groups, in this sense, excuse me, the Europeans versus the native inhabitants, right? We know that the Europeans are coming over here, for example, with their specific gender roles, gender decorum, right? But Indians are going to have different gender ideas, gender roles, right? In other words, notions of how women should behave, what their responsibilities are as opposed to men. Now, the reason why I'm saying this, and by the way, a historian called this gender frontiers, right? When you have this frontier, you have two people meeting, they have different gender customs and leads to conflict, right? Well, in this encounter, we interestingly enough see women working on the field, right? Now, let me tell you that most Europeans, when they first went to colonize and settle in the New World, according to their European gender roles, women do not work in the field. That's a man's job. Okay, so, and furthermore, if you look at this picture closely, right? It's one thing. The women, from the European point of view, are in the states of various states of undress. Okay, that would be considered immoral from the European perspective regarding, gender roles, regarding, of course, culture, religion too, right? The fact that they're, not clothed fully, right, is going to, arouse the consternation and the alarm of the early Europeans who aren't used to this because they have their own gender roles, their own cultural norms, their own mores. Okay, so it leads to conflict, is my main point here. Okay, and I'll expand upon that soon. But just going back to this, our point was this, that they're not all nomadic. They're actually farmers. Some of them, right? Not all of them, but some of them are. All right. Okay. In fact, some of them were city dwellers. Okay, you're probably aware of the cities in, more in South America, like, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire, and so on and so forth, where they had the pyramids and so forth. Well, that indicates to us that, yes, there were sprawling cities that were dense in population um, in the Americas even before contact in 1492. Okay. In fact, here's one city itself that was well known. Right. This was a city called Cahokia. All right. And it was vastly populated, and it survived for quite a few centuries. I believe a couple of centuries in the 13th century. 1200s, 1300s. Okay, so in other words, you see urbanites, city dwellers, not nomads, right? Within that particular um, Indian population. All right. Okay, so again, why are we talking about this? All of this is to underscore the fact that Indians aren't all just nomadic, sort of hunter gatherers, not bound to the earth, roaming around like the Sioux Indian chasing buffalo. They don't know anything about permanent settlement and so forth. No, there's actually a lot of diversity. Now, I just talked about the gender sort of conflict earlier, right? What this is going to lead to is, on a larger scale, conflict. Okay, the fact that you have two civilizations with their respective cultures clashing with each other, right? Thinking that one group of people are being, quote, immoral or unchristian, right? It's going to lead to confrontation and clash, all right? Social or, yeah, discord, right? For example, from the European perspective, it's easy to imagine this. Oh my God, look at the way these Indians are behaving. Look at these women. They're not clothed, and the men are just, letting the women do all the hard work while they go hunting. And, they're barbaric, they're uncivilized, right? There's that word uncivilized that arises because they don't conform to the European understanding of civilization. All right, so you can see how there's a slippery slope in logic, which we'll discuss soon. How people who don't conform to certain standards that are culturally determined in the first place leads to accusations of being, let's say, savage or barbaric or uncivilized. Now, in terms of New World population before 1492 in Columbus, one thing we have to understand that it was very much populated, widely populated. Okay, now I have to say the vast majority of the population was indeed found in what we call South America today, right? Of course, it wasn't called South America back then. But let's say below Mexico and Central America. Well, actually, let me say that Central America plus South America was where most of the New World population was found. But that doesn't mean that North America, above, let's say, what we call Mexico today, right, was sparsely populated. In fact, the estimates vary quite widely, as stated there. That's because the science behind it can't be really conducted with exact precision. But nonetheless, even though there's a disparity between these figures, it does underscore the degree to which it's highly populated. 40 to 75 million before contact, okay, was found in the entirety of the New World. All right, that's 15% of the world's population back then in the late 1490s. All right. Now, even in North America, which, as I mentioned, was less populated, you have 4 to 5 million people. Okay, now, before I get to that 1890 census, which is, of course, the United States Census, I do want to mention this, that what's going to happen, and this pertains, kind of to the current climate of the pandemic, right? What happens, as you might already be aware of, is the transference of deadly pathogens, viruses, right? Microbes, right? Bacteria and so forth, towards which the native inhabitants had no immunological resistance towards. Okay. And there, basically, what happens, therefore, is a demographic catastrophe. In fact, if you look at that figure right there, 40 to 75 million, let's say there were 75 million in 1492. What's going to happen is over 90% of that population will perish in 1 century, let's say by 1600. Okay, so from 1492 to 1600, 90% of that 75 million will perish due largely to disease brought over from Europe, old world diseases that just wreaked havoc upon the New World. Okay, it's one of the worst epidemics in human history. What happened, right? In fact, some historians cite the 1500s, that is the 16th century, as the century in human history marked by the greatest loss of human life. And it's largely due to this, plus some epidemics that are occurring in Europe at that time. All right. Now, going to that census there, it notes that, after the United States was formed, obviously, 1776, so we jump ahead to 1890. You have the census conducted, of course, every 10 years, like we just had 2020, right? 1890, the census takers counted only 250,000 Native Americans. So we went from, let's say, 5 million to 250,000. So how is one to think about that? How do you wrap your head around that? We'll get to that towards the end of this topic, right? But it's something we certainly have to ponder if we are students of U.S. history. We have to engage with that question. What led to that enormous loss of life by the end of this encounter? Okay, we're going to move on to the next PowerPoint presentation.